Okay, so Apple has responded to Spotify's complaint with the European Commission. In this complaint, Spotify claimed that the 30% fee Apple charges on services in its App Store is discriminatory and gives Apple an unfair competitive advantage. Apple have responded to this in a lengthy blog post, which really doesn't address any of the competitive issues that Spotify raise. So what I'll do in this video is go through a summary of Spotify's original complaint and the changes they want to see in the App Store, and then go through Apple's response and how it relates to Spotify's original complaint. So Spotify's original complaint centers around the fact that Apple charges this 30% fee on services that are purchased through the App Store. And they argue that this fee is discriminatory in nature because certain services don't have to pay this fee, including Uber, Deliveroo, and also Apple's own Apple Music service. And then Spotify goes on to argue that if they do pay this 30% fee, it forces them to artificially raise their prices and gives Apple Music an unfair competitive advantage because they can provide a competing service without having to pay this 30% fee. And then if they don't pay this 30% fee, Apple places restrictions on their apps and makes it difficult to do a number of things, provide services to their customers. So the example of limitations that Spotify cite if they don't pay this 30% fee include not being able to communicate with their customers properly, so they can't send promotions to customers through the app. Also, Apple places certain restrictions on the email communications that they're allowed to send out to customers that were acquired through the app. Spotify also claims that if you don't pay this 30% fee, Apple makes it very difficult for customers to upgrade to Spotify Premium. So if they're not paying this fee, customers have to upgrade via a browser or via a desktop, and Spotify also isn't allowed to mention in the free app how to do this upgrade, so customers have to figure it out for themselves, and it's a very cumbersome process. So that has a negative impact on sign-ups of Spotify Premium. Then another downside that Spotify experienced because they don't pay this 30% fee is that Apple places restrictions on the App Store, and because of these restrictions, Spotify claims that their app gets rejected a lot of the time. So they're claiming they want to provide an improved app to users, but they claim Apple keeps rejecting this app. And then finally, one more downside of not paying this 30% fee is that Apple makes it difficult for customers to get Spotify on all their devices. So they claim the restrictions make it more difficult for customers to use Spotify on the Apple Watch and the HomePod specifically, and they also claim that it has limited integration with Siri because of the restrictions Apple has placed on its App Store. So that's the crux of Spotify's complaint, and then as a result of this complaint, they wanted three main changes to be seen in the App Store. First, they wanted all apps to be subject to the same fair set of rules and restrictions, including Apple Music. Second, they want consumers to have a real choice of payment systems. So currently the only payment option is through Apple's payment processor. They want consumers to be able to choose from a range of payment processors. And then finally, they don't want app stores to be able to prohibit communications between the service provider and the customer. So once Spotify's acquired the customers through an Apple app, they want to be able to fully communicate with that customer and offer them promotions and other types of communications as they please. So that's the crux of Spotify's complaint and the changes they want to see in the App Store. Now let's move on and look at Apple's response. So it's quite a lengthy response. If you want to check out the full statement, you can do that on Apple's newsroom. What I'm going to do is just highlight some of the key points Apple make and how they relate to Spotify's original complaint. So the first part of Apple's response I want to examine is related to what they claim Spotify is trying to do. So Apple say, after using the App Store for years to dramatically grow their business, Spotify seeks to keep all the benefits of the App Store ecosystem, including the substantial revenue that they draw from the App Store's customers, without making any contributions to that marketplace. So basically what Apple is claiming here is that Spotify wants to be able to distribute and promote the premium version of its app through Apple's App Store without paying any fee to Apple. Now, based on Spotify's statements, I don't think this assertion by Apple is true. What I think is going on is that Spotify is saying that the 30% fee is too high, so they want that fee to be lower. And then they also want consumers to have a choice of payment providers, because when there's a choice of payment providers, that adds competition too. So then if there's payment providers that offer lower fees, Apple will then be encouraged to lower their fee as well and stop charging such a high rate of 30%. So the next part of Apple's statement I want to examine is that Spotify claims we are blocking access to their apps, products, and updates to their apps. So I'm not going to read the entire text of this, but basically in this section of text, Apple is suggesting that they've allowed Spotify to have numerous app updates. They've helped them with various app integrations. So the claim by Spotify that their ecosystem places restrictions on the Spotify app and makes it more difficult for the Spotify app to work with certain Apple services and hardware is bogus. That's basically what Apple are trying to suggest here. So this is probably the best point Apple makes in their response, but even though they do make some good points and highlight where they have helped Spotify develop new features and have helped them integrate with Apple services and hardware, they still really don't address everything. For example, one thing that Spotify cites is that playing Apple Music on the HomePod is really easy, whereas playing Spotify on the HomePod is a much more cumbersome process for consumers. So that gives Apple Music a competitive advantage. And when they're talking about that in this section, they make no mention of the HomePod and no mention of how Spotify's had a tougher time integrating with the HomePod. So ultimately, this response does give some contrast to Spotify's claims, and it does show Apple supports Spotify some of the time, but it still doesn't address the core issues Spotify raise. There are still some existing examples where Apple is blocking Spotify from having an easy integration with its products and services. Then the next claim I want to look at is a bit further down the page, and it's this paragraph here where Apple says, "The only contribution that Apple requires is for digital goods and services that are purchased inside the app using our secure in-app purchase system. As Spotify points out, that revenue share is 30% for the first year of an annual subscription, but they left out that it drops to 50% in the years later." So this is a good point. Spotify were being quite sneaky by leaving out the 15% fee. However, Spotify's main point still does stand, even though they didn't focus on this 15% fee. Spotify's main point was that the fee Apple charges is too high. Even at 15%, that seems too high when a lot of other payment processors charge around 5%. And even if the fee does drop to 15%, it still doesn't address the fact that a competing service like Apple Music doesn't have to pay this 15% fee. So even by charging a service like Spotify 15%, Spotify is still having to pay an additional substantial cost that Apple Music doesn't have to pay, which will then still cause them to have to artificially raise their prices. So the next part of Apple's statement I want to look at is further down the page. And it's this sentence here: Spotify is asking to keep all those benefits while also retaining 100% of the revenue. To me, based on Spotify's statements, this is not true. I feel like Spotify is just claiming that the 30% fee is too high and that they want more competition by allowing alternate payment processors to be offered to customers. I don't see anything in Spotify's complaints or their messaging around the complaint that suggests they don't want to pay anything to Apple. They're just suggesting that they want the rules to be fair, they want the same standards applied to all, and by doing this it will naturally cause Apple to lower the fee, because when there's alternate payment processors, the market will be more competitive, so Apple won't be able to continue carry on charging that 30% fee. And then there's just one more part of Apple's response I want to look at now, and that's this paragraph below that sentence here. Spotify wouldn't be the business they are today without the App Store ecosystem, but now they're leveraging their scale to avoid contributing to maintaining that ecosystem for the next generation of app entrepreneurs. We think that's wrong. So again, as I've said multiple times, I don't feel like, based on Spotify's statements, they are trying to not contribute, they just think 30% is too excessive. And also the point that Spotify wouldn't be the business they are today without the App Store kind of highlights Spotify's original point that Apple has a monopoly on this marketplace and that it's using that monopoly to act in an anti-competitive way. So yes, it's probably true that Spotify wouldn't be the business they are today without the App Store, but that's because consumers haven't really had any other choice but the App Store if they use Apple hardware. So overall, Apple's response is pretty weak. They seem to be claiming that Spotify doesn't want to pay anything when I don't see anything to suggest that in Spotify's statement. They don't do anything to really address Spotify's core complaints, which are that Apple has too much control over the App Store, Apple doesn't apply the rules fairly, Apple doesn't apply the rules to its own products, and that Apple uses these rules to benefit its own services. So none of those things are addressed in this statement. Ultimately, it's not a very good response. So based on these two statements, it seems like we're at a bit of a standoff. Spotify claims that the 30% fee and the App Store policies are unfair, discriminatory, and anti-competitive, and Apple is claiming that's not the case. Even though I don't personally agree with their reasoning, they're both basically just at a standoff and opposing each other. However, even though these two companies are a standoff, what I do think this is doing is drawing even more attention on the monopolies and anti-competitive practices of big tech companies. So recently we've seen a trend towards this. We've seen a lot of people focusing on this issue. So I think Apple's response is going to draw even more attention to this and draw even more scrutiny to this. And the pressure may eventually force Apple to actually implement some of Spotify's changes. So to give you a few examples of what I mean by this, we have a number of politicians coming out against big tech and suggesting they should be regulated in various ways. So first we have Elizabeth Warren. She's called for the breakup of Amazon, Facebook and Google. And then after she called for their breakup, she also called for the App Store to be broken up from Apple's main company too. Then we also had Tulsi Gabbard tweet this quite recently. We must be willing to fight for the right of all Americans to express their views even when we disagree with them. We must encourage unfettered discussions of public issues and stand united to stop Facebook and others from attempting to censor, stifle, influence public debate. So while this type of speech doesn't apply to Apple directly, even though you could make some arguments that Apple does censor through its App Store, it's still placing emphasis on big tech, their monopolistic power, and their power to engage in anti-competitive practices. So it's still drawing more attention and pressure on the issue, and companies seem to be responding to this pressure now. So for example, in the last few days, Google added DuckDuckGo as a default search engine in its Chromium search engine. While we don't know for sure why they did this, it seems to be because politicians are raising more awareness of big tech monopolies and anti-competitive practices, so they're now changing their behaviour to reduce scrutiny and reduce the chances of them getting regulated. So by Google putting in a competing search engine in its product, there's less ammunition for people to say, well, you're just promoting your own search engine. And then another example that's also happened in the last few days is Amazon ended its policy that prevented third-party merchants from selling products on other sites at a lower price. So again, this is another example of a practice that could have been perceived as anti-competitive by Amazon, and Amazon abusing its monopoly power. Amazon have made this change now to reduce that scrutiny and to reduce the chances of it being accused of anti-competitive practices. So politicians are piling on the pressure, companies are now responding. So even though Apple at the moment in response to Spotify seems to be doubling down and insisting all its policies are fair and that it's not going to change anything, we may see in the very near future that they will loosen up a bit on their rules and start to implement policies that appear to be more fair to third-party developers as more pressure mounts on this issue of anti-competitive practices and monopolistic power. So that's my take on Apple's response to Spotify. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you soon in another video.